Okay. Well, thank you so much for those that already attended. We are trying to be prompt, so hopefully we will be starting this webinar now. First of all, good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to the webinar series with ESCP Business School. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Ben Boyer and the topic, What Behavioral Science Can Tell Us About Buying Behavior in the Wake of a Pandemic, which should be a very interesting discussion. The discussion session will be for 30 minutes, and following that, we will have a Q&A session. Just a little bit of house rules for all of you. You will see, or you should be able to see, a question mark sign, or some of you will see a red box with a question mark sign inside. Please make sure to click on that and send your questions to the organizers. In this case, would be me. And we will say all your questions out loud for Professor Boyer during the session or after the session for a smooth, good conversational flow. Okay? And now, without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Boyer. Please enjoy your session and see you for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krochenka, and welcome everyone to this webinar, wherever you may be watching us. It's a really great pleasure to be live from London with you and to share some insights into what behavioral science can tell us about buying behavior in the wake of a pandemic. The way I've organized this webinar is actually based on a lot of media work I've done in the last few weeks. So I got interviewed on TV, radio, and by the press, and I got a lot of great questions from journalists. And I wanted to share with you a bit about, what this has taught me from a psychological background as to how we can explain what's happening at the moment. Let me start by giving you a bit of an idea of how I look at things as a psychologist. The pandemic that we're currently living has a lot of individual drivers, so we all react to it differently. That's what I call the personality aspect of things. So we all have different personalities. Some of us are high in extroversion, low on extroversion, high on neuroticism, low on neuroticism. These are what psychologists call personality traits. And our personality traits affect how we react to events and how we react to things like the ones that are happening in a pandemic. Then there is a cognitive dimension to it. Cognition is about information processing. So when we think about cognition and cognitive psychology, we look at how the brain processes information and how you give it a stimulus, a piece of information, and then how you get a response out of it. Then there is a fascinating social and cultural dimension to how we're behaving. So not only are our personality traits affecting our behaviors, but the people that we are interacting with, our cultural environments actually have an effect on the way we behave. And we'll talk a bit about that during our seminar when we question what could be the cultural differences in behaving in a pandemic. And last but not least, evolutionary psychology is also an interesting angle of approach when it comes to understanding pandemic behavior. The idea behind evolutionary psychology is that we've evolved to be in an environment that was not the kind of modern contemporary environment we're currently in, but an environment that was shaped and that our hunter-gatherers ancestors were evolving in. And that means that the kind of decision that we're making are still biased, based and biased by the kind of thinking that was available back then. Let's start with something that we've all seen in the past few weeks. Empty shelves that are around the world showing products that are missing. So this leads me to my first kind of question that I'd like to address is, what's going on? Why are we stockpiling things? What are the psychological processes that can explain this stockpiling? The first thing I would put forward is the prevention versus promotion focus that we have at play in our way of processing information. Generally speaking, we've evolved to seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's a kind of a natural way of regulating your emotions and your behaviors. And we know that people that are more with a promotion focus, or when we are more in a promotion mindset, we're more into seeking pleasures than avoiding pain, which is what we do when we are in a prevention focus. When you are in a situation like a pandemic, you suddenly shift from promotion to prevention. That is, you pay much more attention to what could go wrong, what you need to do to prevent things from going even further wrong. And that change of mindset affects a lot of the decisions that you're making. So if you're not naturally someone that stockpiles, the fact that you suddenly become more prevention focused might mean that you are going actually to stockpile. Fight or flight, I was talking about evolutionary psychology earlier, but we really have evolved to make instant decisions, not the kind of decisions that we can dwell on for weeks or for months. When you are in the kind of context that we're living into, which is that of a pandemic, we suddenly have to make very instant decisions and decisions that are fight or flight reactions. And so if you walk around and if the feedback you get from the store is one where there's a shortage or not many of your favorite products, you're more likely to make that instant decision to actually go for it and decide to actually buy that product, even though maybe you already have some stock at home for the product. Something else that is at play, if you remember earlier, I talked about norms and how the social and cultural environment actually affect our behaviors. Now, perceived norms is when you suddenly believe or perceive that others and the majority are acting in a certain way. And so if you walk in the supermarket and you see everyone with toilet paper in the trolley, because toilet paper was one of these items that suddenly gone missing everywhere, well, you're more likely to think that this is suddenly a norm. And that way you're going to start obeying to that norm. You're going to start following that norm and therefore start stockpiling again. There is also what is now almost in our everyday vocabulary, but the fear of missing out, FOMO. You're starting to project yourself and tell yourself, well, you know, what if I actually need it at some point and I can't get it? And altogether, this kind of points out to what I would call a self-fulfilling, or what psychologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy. The idea that you're anticipating other people engaging in certain behaviors, you're changing your own behaviors, and as a result, you're making things happen. So it was not something that was meant to happen, but everyone anticipating each other's behaviors as if they were certain is something that actually made all of this happen. So if we dig a bit deeper on what I said earlier was how our brain processes information. So what can cognitive psychology tell us about buying behavior? Well, first of all, we tend to memorize negative information more so than we do memorize positive information. That's something that actually we've evolved to do. It's helpful in terms of survival if we can remember negative information, because negative information often is something that can affect our own survival. From an information processing point of view, at the moment, we have a lot of information to process. So we are in what we call high cognitive load. There's a lot of things that is going on in our head that's interacting with our stress, that's interacting with all the decisions that we have to make. And what we know in psychology is that when you are in a situation of high cognitive load, you're likely to make differences, you're likely to make decisions in a different way. This could be, for instance, relying on heuristics, that is shortcuts, rather than actually thinking through all the decisions that you could or should be making. And something else that is interesting when it comes to information processing at the moment is that we live at a time where we develop selective perception. We see the world from the lenses of someone that is actually experiencing a lockdown if you're in a country that has a lockdown. It means that it's difficult to project yourself. It means that you may feel that everything is going to change forever, because right now your life is undergoing a lot of changes. It may be that suddenly, because you're wearing a face mask, you're noticing everyone on the street wearing a face mask. That's because you've primed yourself to wear one, if you're wearing one, and then paying attention to that. This has a lot of consequences. This should change your perception of norms. So suddenly you pay attention to people wearing face masks, and you may think, well, the norm now is that people are wearing face masks. Another thing that I find interesting, and that came out in the discussions I had with a lot of the journalists I was working with in the last few weeks, is why are we not always listening to advice? We've seen that people were telling us that there was enough food and stock in supermarket, yet we were not really believing that, and our behaviors got affected. Why are some people ignoring the lockdown and shelter-in-place orders? Well, there are quite a few reasons that we could put forward. The first one might strike you as questionable. Not feeling concerned or not being really involved into the whole pandemic that is going on at the moment. After all, this is everywhere on the news. Yes, but some people may not feel it applies to them. If you think about younger people, teenagers, who have been reading a lot about how their peers, their age group seems to be less affected by what's happening than other age group, this lowers your feeling of being concerned with it. This means that you're likely to be less involved with all those messages. What we know from persuasion theories is that when you're not as involved with the message, you're less likely to be persuaded by rational argument. That means that you might have a very strong list of reasons why you should behave in such a way, why you should shelter in place, but you might actually not feel like this is something that is relevant for you. Something else, again, that can be pinpointed to psychology is a bit of a disbelief that obvious, simple things can work. Initially, for instance, in the UK, the main advice from the government was wash your hands. That's the best thing you can do. Before there were any discussions of perhaps inviting people to wear face masks on the street. The idea was that if you wash your hands and follow conventional hygiene norms, this is the best you can do to prevent the spread of the disease. And sometimes when people see, on the one hand, very severe consequences of the virus all around the world, and then advice that are being given that are or sound very basic, this can cause some disbelief and people not listening, not acting towards all of these. And this leads us to something quite important that psychologists have been researching for almost 4 decades now, which are the way you can persuade someone. And there are 2 ways to persuade people. Now, you might think that the most logical way of persuading people is precisely to give them a list of arguments. That is logical indeed, and that's what we call the central route to persuasion, or the rational route to persuasion. Indeed, for a lot of people, getting very precise rationales as to why they should behave in such way is a way to persuade them. But as I've said before, sometimes people will not feel concerned. And so for those that do not feel concerned, persuasion with the rational route is going to be useless, well, to a certain extent at least. And that's why you need to use another way of persuading people. Now, that other way of persuading people is what psychologists call the peripheral route to persuasion. If you take back the 1980s models by Petty and Cacciopa, for instance, and you're relying on other ways to persuade people, for instance, the emotional route. So you're having an emotional argument, maybe it's a family that is torn apart by images or by their close relatives being affected by COVID-19, and that emotional reaction that you're seeing and your natural empathy that is connecting with this, means that you are likely to be persuaded by these emotional connections much more so than you are by rational arguments if you do not feel concerned initially. And something else that I want to put forward is this false uniqueness bias, especially in the Western world. In the Western world, we tend to think that we're quite unique in our being, and especially in what makes us great. So all of our skills, we tend to feel that fewer people than in real life actually share those skills, and vice versa. So we tend to feel that people share our sins or the things that we do that we know we shouldn't do, like eating unhealthily. So we've got that false sense of feeling unique. This is something that is much more common in the Western world, but this can lead to sense of feeling overly secure, because you feel that, oh, all those people that are catching the disease are not healthy, or they're not going to the gym. So you're constructing an attribution, you're constructing an explanation of what's happening that means that you think that you're better or different from others, and as such, you're less likely to be affected. And that's why you may not listen to all of these advice. Another thing then that it leads us to thinking and discussing is, how long are we likely to behave differently? So at the moment, we all feel that our life is kind of changing almost forever, and a lot of discourses in the media, on social media, and even when you hear official speeches, governments, and so on, it looks like we're going to be dramatically changing the way we behave for good and for a long time. That's not as simple as that. If anything, we know that people are not good at sticking to their New Year's resolutions. Perhaps you had some New Year's resolutions this year that are already long gone and vanished a few weeks, a few days, a few hours, a few months after New Year. Well, anything that will stay with us would need to have two things attached to it so that it actually stays with us. We're likely to stick to something if it brings benefits. So any of the behaviors we've been engaged into, if we feel that they bring us something good, if we work from home, maybe we save time commuting, maybe it means that we can go for a short run if we're allowed to go out during lunchtime, and we like that because we don't have that possibility at work. So anything that brings us some benefits is likely to stay. But it's likely to stay if the constraints associated with it or what is needed to keep up with the habit has got a low cost attached to it. Anything that is not bringing any benefits or that is too costly to maintain is something that is unlikely to stay. Even if right now we feel that this is something that is durable, that's related to selective perception, one of the things that we discussed earlier, and that's something that affects our capacity to process information. Now, I want to go back to some of those images where you were saying this is Venice Beach in California, where you see people going into public spaces when maybe they're discouraged to do so. What can we do and how can we use behavioral science to make people more likely to stick to rules? The first key notion is what we call delayed gratification. I love the concept of delayed gratification. Some of you might know it as the marshmallow experiment. You put a child in front of a bowl of marshmallow and you tell them that if they can patiently wait until the person that is in the room comes back, they'll get all the marshmallows. And you test their patience. You explain them that they'll get gratified by their being patient in exchange of that time and that sacrifice that they're doing. At the moment, if we want people to stick to behaviors, we need to explain that the short-term sacrifices will be way compensated by the long-term benefits of going back to what people call normal life or life as we used to know it. Behavioral science also tells you that you need to find the right balance between positive information so that people have something to look forward to, and risk-related information. Risk-related information are important because they give people a sense of, careful, I need to pay attention to things, I need to stick to certain prescribed behaviors, and so on. Something else that we notice is that one of the reasons people stop sticking to rules is that they start being bored. And so behavioral science tells you that if you start gamifying, turning something into a game, people forget that the things they have to do is boring, and they start engaging more with it. So perhaps you could introduce some challenges with your neighborhoods so that people support each other, people do activities across their balconies as a way to kind of like make the self-isolation, quarantine, lockdown more fun, and to escape the kind of monotony of what this is about. And last but not least, it's important to give people some information feedback. If you want to change people's behavior, they need to know how well they are doing. In fact, in relation to the previous point on gamification, people are motivated in doing well. And so if you tell them that they're doing well, for instance, we are good at flattening the curve, that's something that will encourage people to carry on doing well and keep on motivating them. Some other things that we could try and do. Switch from persuasion to influence. Now, you may think that persuasion and influence are one and the same, but actually they're not. In psychology and in consumer psychology especially, persuasion refers to changing someone's attitude. Influence, on the other end, refers to changing someone's behavior. You can act a way, in a certain way, but not be persuaded that this is the right thing to do. You just do it because other people are doing it. So you're using social norm to influence the behavior. And as we've said before, a lot of people will not be persuaded by a rational argument. So by influencing them, rather than trying to persuade them, you're more likely to actually achieve the outcome that you want. And at the end of the day, if you want to be a bit cynical, it doesn't really matter if people are convinced deep down that the lockdown is useful. What you want is actually to find a way to make sure that they are doing and acting in a certain way. The next thing I want to say is it's important to co-create anything you're doing and engage the citizens that you're working with. So make sure that people feel part of what's happening. If you do so, if people feel part of what's happening, they're much more likely to stick to the behaviors because they feel that they're part of the origin of the behavior. Using social norm is also something we do a lot in behavioral science. We do this a lot because we know people like to stick to norms. For instance, if you tell people that most people follow a certain type of behavior, they're more likely to follow it. Research shows that if you tell people that the majority of customers in a hotel follow norms, people are more likely to follow norms. And last but not least, simple things such as behavioral checks can help. So sending people text to check, if they haven't been out when they shouldn't be going out, if they're all right and they have food, anything that can means that regularly you check on people's behavior, or you remind them, for instance, to wash their hands, is something that can help promote positive behaviors. Now, I want to quickly dig a bit deeper into goal-setting theories of motivation. If you want to motivate people, what we know is that you need to do a series of things. First, you need to remind people that the goals are important. Second, you need to make the goal specifics. The looser the goals, the less likely you will be that people will identify and adhere to those goals. But goals need to be attainable. They need to be reachable. If you tell people right away that they're going to be living in this kind of environment for a month, they're less likely to actually be sticking to that behavior. And last but not least, having a bit of pressure in terms of what's coming up immediately is something that's proven to actually motivate people to do well. So if you have some moving dates as to on that date we'll be able to do this, and on that date we'll be able to do that, and so on and so forth, you're going to keep people's motivation going. Now, at the start of the webinar, I was telling you about the role of culture. And one of the things that I've been interested in as a cultural psychologist is to ask myself, could part of what we see here be explained by some of the things that are the cultural differences that we know? And we know that culture vary according to two important dimensions, among other dimensions, which are individualism and collectivism. People in so-called collectivist countries favor common well-being more than people in individualistic countries. In a collectivist country, I take care of you because I know you'll take care of me. In an individualistic country, you take care of yourself, I take care of myself. A lot of the differences that we can pinpoint in terms of cultural differences, for instance, in wearing face masks, it can be tracked down to this and rooted in these cultural differences of individualism and collectivism. Personal distance is an interesting psychological concept, which refers to the extent to which you're comfortable being close to other people and talking close to other people. And we know that in some cultures, people talk to each other in a very close manner. That's part of a small cultural distance, cultural personal distance. And last but not least, how people explain differences will vary across culture. The self-serving bias is the idea that, especially in the Western world, we tend to think that other people are more likely to deserve what's happening to them because they really wanted this to happen. When we explain our own behaviors, we tend to use situational attribution. That is, we explain it by a matter of circumstances, but not by a matter of who we are. And that can again explain why in some cultures, people feel that this could not happen to them because they are unique and different. What could be the long-term consequences? In other words, could these behaviors stick with us for a long time? Well, first of all, there could be some changes in personal distance. This is something that we can incorporate gradually in our behaviors. These also could lead to changes in terms of approach and avoidance behavior. So this could slightly reshape our sense of altruism, at least in the midterm, but there could be long-term consequences into that. But they could be positive as well. We could be bringing people together by shifting their sense of the self, because we've been forced during this pandemic to take the perspective of the other. So there could be shift in self-control, and we could become more interdependent in our sense of the self and start taking more the perspective of the other. And last but not least, one could wonder whether there could be some longer-term focus shift. That is, we could become more prevention-driven rather than promotion-driven. So all in all, there could still be some long-term consequences. The extent to which there would be long-term consequences would mostly depend on whether and how long we have to stick to those behaviors. If by September we're back to normal life, so to say, it's unlikely that a lot of the things that we've had to cope with and change in the last few weeks last for a long time. But if some of the behaviors we're currently having to follow are lasting over 12, 18 months or more, this is likely to have a longer term impact on our behavior. Quickly before I bring this to last few personal advice and to a close, I also want to highlight the limits of behavioral science. That is, the things that I've discussed today are based on previous research done in the last few decades, but you have to understand that we've never witnessed something at that scale. A lot of the studies that have been done in a lab experiment, working with the student population, has never really reached that kind of large-scale experiment. And this shows the difficulty for preparing a population to something that hopefully never really happened more than once in a lifetime. There's a lot of research around safety culture to prepare people for accident, but when accident almost never happen, but people still need to be prepared. If you think about airline safety, in our entire lifetime, out of all the attendees of this webinar, the chances of winning the national lottery are probably higher than the chances of being injured or dying in an airplane crash. And that shows the difficulty of preparing people, making them pay attention to something that rarely happens. Another thing that is a limitation is that at the moment, a lot of things are happening at the same time. So we see change in the healthcare system. We see people dying around us. We see natural disasters. So the interdependence of all of these events means that it's difficult to isolate just one factor, one cause for what is happening. Last but not least, attitude versus behaviors. We know in psychology that attitude, people's opinion, people's thoughts about certain things are actually loosely related to their behaviors. In other words, people might think one way, behave another way. And so a lot of the things that we're seeing at the moment may actually not have a long-lasting effect for one precise reason, which is that people's attitude may change, but their behavior may stay the same. Last few tips for you. What can I do to feel better? First of all, stay away from bad news. There's a lot of research that was done around 9/11 that shows that the more people process bad information around peak stressful time, the more they develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Simplify your decision making. Only read a few trusted sources and do not engage in uncertain and speculation news articles. So if you read a fancy title such as there may be something here going on there, if it's highly speculative, just don't engage with it. Your brain much prefer and your mind much prefer certainty over any speculation. And last advice, do not relay information. Get information, but stop sharing things that are speculative, that could lead to an argument, a debate. They're unlikely to be productive. They're unlikely to make you feel better. Finally, I've put some links for you that you will be able to see on the webinar. These are links that are actually from the British Psychological Society and Psychological Science that have put together some very valuable information. And as you know, we've got an upcoming series, and we hope to see more of you then on all of the exciting topics that we've developed. So thank you very much for listening. Now we've finished with the first half an hour, and it's time for questions and answers. Krochenka, I cannot hear you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ben, for that. That was really, really good. I appreciate your time. Actually, we have a few questions, but the first one is a comment, not a question. And I thought it was an interesting comment that maybe you could address, just because you talked about attitudes and behaviors. So I thought it was relevant to that topic. So one of our participants said that they actually didn't really agree that young people don't feel concerned about the pandemic, and that in fact they believe that because of social media, if they were to decide to go out, they will not be respected and not respect the quarantine. They will not be respected by the community, or they will probably be judged by the community. Do you think that this is a normal trend, is something that we can see within the younger community as well?
Yes, I do think that what's happening is we tend to work as communities. And if you take a social identity point of view on this, people have groups that they belong to, and they can be generational group like, millennials, Gen Z, and so on. And you tend to construct a group identity, a social identity, against other groups. And I think what the risk that we're seeing at the moment is a risk of, in a way, generational conflicts or generational differences being accentuated by misrepresentation of the other group's behavior. So maybe younger people might feel that their elderly are overreacting, and maybe also they may feel misjudged, or they may feel that the kind of behaviors that they're engaging into are misinterpreted. I think that the best way to overcome this is to try to give each other's more accurate feedback. When I was telling earlier that we should be careful not to over-relay information, I think the main risk is that when you relay information such as, oh, there's been like a lockdown party that was done in Brixton and stopped by the police, you're spreading information that may be misinterpreted by other people and may think, oh, everyone, all the younger people are behaving in such and such way. So we need to be quite careful in how we portray each other's behavior so that we don't end up creating this kind of like conflicting views of each other's.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Thank you for that. So now we will start with the flow of questions. Another question we have is, how can you explain delayed gratification to people working in environments where there is no timeline, or if gratification is viewed as too far?
I think that's a very good question. In the original marshmallow experiment, the timeline was very short, but we were dealing with very young kids. And so the timeline was something like 15 minutes or an hour at most when they vary the age groups, for instance. What you need to be able to have is some sort of a moving target and breaking things down. So if we know in a way what the end point of everything we're living at the moment is if we are able to develop a vaccine, if and one that is efficient, if and when a majority of the population that can be vaccinated is vaccinated, and we get immunity that way, we know from previous vaccines that we will end up eradicating the disease. But that's the endpoint. Until that endpoint is reached, there are a lot of milestones that need to be made more transparent. So in a way, one way of twisting the question is to say, if the endpoint is far away, what are the positive intermediate steps that we can take to motivate people? In other words, if you're trying to run a marathon, which is a bit more than 26 miles, you may want to step it back and say, well, it's like running, 4 times, 6 times a shorter distance, so that people focus on the next steps rather than on the bigger picture. We do know that breaking down big objective into steps that sound much more achievable is one way to actually make it more accessible for people.
Yes, thank you for that. That's very clear, actually. This is an interesting one. What changes do you see in sports or entertainment industry post COVID-19 era?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would make two differences here. Is that there is sport as an individual practice or collective but non-professional practice, and the kind of collective sports. If I go back to my earlier comments about sports and social identity, sports supporting your national team, your favorite city, at whichever sport, football, soccer, or else, is something that is part of your identity. And in fact, you go to a stadium not so much to see what's happening, because quite frankly, you see it much better on TV these days. You may have like an ultra HD connection and you're able to watch close up of the action. So you're not going to the stadium to actually see what's happening. You're going to the stadium to get reminded and overwhelmed by the shared social identity that you have by supporting your favorite team. And this is something that actually is difficult to address. If we have to go and reopen collective sport, professional sports, in a way that we limit the audience, the live audience, the main challenge for people in the industry will be to try and find a way to get that social identity part of taking part to a live event as strong or as closely strong as possible to being in a live stadium. So I'm sure there are ways, and this is something I've actually in a way been I've been thinking about it, ways of recreating like the atmosphere and the shared identity in an audience. But this will be a real challenge, because it's realizing that sports is something that goes much beyond just watching the technical aspects of the sports. When it comes to like non-professional sports, one of the things that could be interesting is to see whether we see a rise of individual sports over collective sports. That's again, that's a hypothesis I'm making here, or a supposition, but we could see a rise of individualistic sports that do not require partners, team players, for the practical reasons that we're and the kind of restrictions that we're into at the moment.
That's very interesting, because when I was seeing this question, I also thought, well, you can see it from different dimensions, like you going to watch a sport, it is actually a community activity, but then you also have this activity of actually being in the sport or managing the sport or wanting to have a sense of community. So that's why you join a sport. So this, it will be interesting how that changes, or that mentality changes moving forward. So quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we have more questions, quite a few actually. So we'll try to speed through. Actually, here we have two in one. So I will start with one, which is, sorry, let me get here. What are the different cognitive strategies that countries use when trying to influence public behavior? That's a big question.
Yeah. Well, I think what's been used at the moment is the fear appeal. So the immediacy of the danger to trigger that kind of fight or flight reaction from people is something that's been at play. It's a clever short-term strategy. I'm saying short-term because this is unlikely to work in the middle or the long term. And you may have heard a lot of politicians saying, this is this is going into the long run game, and the virus is going to be in our life in the coming months, if not, maybe a year or longer. And that's a start. That's the start of a shift in terms of the kind of cognitive mechanism that people are trying to trigger, that goes beyond the kind of fear that triggers a kind of immediate reaction of, okay, there's a fear, I need to get away from the danger, and that's sheltering in place and so on. Then what I would say is that for a lot of countries, simplifying information, so making sure that you have things that are as simple as possible, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So you've seen in some countries, they've categorized cities or regions with what we call traffic light systems. So green, few cases of COVID-19, hospital capacity is good to deal with the current cases. Orange, slight sign of perhaps overload, and red, severe or real actual issues in handling the COVID-19 patients. And that kind of like decision making being simplified is something that is good. If you want people to stick to behaviors, stick to norms, things need to be clear, precise, and easy to follow. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in schools, because if anything, we know that kids need to be reminded of rules a lot and are not necessarily good at following rules. In fact, that's one of the societal function of schools, if you want, is to socialize kids so that they understand the importance of social norms, rules, respecting rules, and so on. So even at ages where they're not necessarily able to do so, which is why often countries that have reopened school have not necessarily done that with the youngest first, because the youngest are less likely to even understand the idea of social distance and the importance of distanciating yourself.
And there's also, coming to the same question, so it's attached to it, but here is now talking about the real struggles in a community that is facing poverty, for example, and access of water, electricity is already a challenge. How do you tell this people or these communities that they need to prioritize the behaviors to kind of fight COVID-19 when they already have so many difficulties in their day-to-day lives?
Yeah, to be honest, this is like probably one of the most important questions, especially as the pandemic is getting under control in the wealthier world, in the Western world, or the Eastern wealthier countries. It is a real issue because what we know, and even if you want to take a kind of more basic perspective on it with the Maslow's hierarchy of need, you're going down to feeding yourself. And I was having some discussions with friends of mine in South Africa, and they're saying that one of the issues of having a lockdown in a country like South Africa is that you risk starvation very soon. Because if people are not able to go out or work in farms and so on, you're really facing very difficult trade-off. I think that the only thing that can be done in those contexts is find a way to provide as much care as possible for what people are already struggling with, as a way for them to kind of like compensate for the extra effort that is required from them. So trying in a way to find that to offset their usual daily life struggles by saying, well, we'll cater for this if you can help us by staying at home and fighting the spread of the virus. But there you really are fighting against people's natural instincts, and it is very difficult to do so, as we've seen so far.
Yeah, that's very interesting and a good way of looking at things, because it's a difficult topic to discuss. Moving on, you talk about the tyranny of information. If people are overloaded with information, what motivates them to ignore the information and make decision with their instincts? It is kind of a burden to process all that information and to go through that information. So how do you even manage that? How do you go about that?
Well, typically what we know is that people that are under high cognitive load, so have a lot of information to process at the same time, are going to look for heuristics, shortcuts, if you want, mental shortcuts, to simplify the decision and go for certain types of information. So if you have a lot of different recommendations, you may go for the government source if you trust the government, and you may say, well, I'm going to not listen to X and Y and Z, but just follow the government official information. The quality of a news outlet, you may be more likely to follow a trusted established news outlet compared to a tabloid or a non or less trusted form of information. But this is also where you could have your decision making disrupted by other types of information. So after weeks of sending people a very rational sets of messages, coming up with more emotional messages, showcasing the success of people coming together at one. And I see a lot of positive in all of the movements around the world that come in support of healthcare workers. All of these reinforces people's sense of collective identity. It reinforces people from and give them that sense of, yes, we are in this together. And when I clap outside to support the NHS in the UK and the health services in other countries, this is a way that I have to feel prouder and part of that emotional connection I have with my peers. So at some point, when you're overloaded with information, you can shortcut for trusted sources, but you can also decide to go for other I would say factors that can influence your decision making. Emotions, celebrity endorsement. So if someone that you esteem, is telling you to stay at home and save lives, maybe that's going to resonate more if you really admire that person than if you hear it from a politician that you may or may not like, may or may not trust.
And there is another comment just based on that response, where they're saying, that they've noticed that the media and especially the mainstream TV have produced ads and programs to use people's emotions and influence them by showing maybe infected people or family suffering. So the question is, can we say that media is trying to influence the public behavior and choices by using behavioral science techniques? And do you think that this is ethical in the first place?
Well, I'll answer to the first and then the second part of the question. The first part of the question, I would say media are trying to portray a certain reality of what's happening. Whether they're directly trying to influence people is something that is debatable. It depends on how they are framing the programs that they're using. One of the key things that is important in order to change people's behavior, to influence people, is relatability. So if I can relate to something, if I can relate to the person that is sending the message, I'm more likely to relate to it. So this is, for instance, I was quite critical of the UK government's campaign on TikTok, because rather than using the typical TikTok user, which is Generation Z or a younger audience, they would use older political figures to deliver messages. And if you are in that target category of being Gen Z or millennial, you're less likely to relate to that message because it's coming from someone that you can't really relate to. So I think that saying that the media is trying to influence may be a step too far. I do think that part of what they do and part of the way they communicate information can lead to influence, but I would stop short of saying that this is deliberate, because I'm not the one that is behind the media, and thus I wouldn't know whether this is deliberate or not. Now, second part of the question, whether it's ethical or not, I think this would send us back to a lot of the debates on ethics and morality, even in philosophy or in my field, in social psychology. There are debates about morality and following moral norms and so on. But some people may argue that, and some classic philosophers may argue that it's fine to actually mislead people if it's for their own goods. Others would argue against that. So I think the answer to this question I would leave to the great philosophers, Kant and Schopenhauer and all the great ones.
Yes, definitely. I would like to say before we carry on with the questions, if you can go back a slide on the links. I think some people would like to see the links
Absolutely.
that you share with us. That'll be great.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. So here you have it. Hopefully you can all see it. Yes, take a screenshot. That would be great. So another question would be, can you give an example for changing attitude first versus changing behavior first?
Sure. So the idea of changing attitudes is to make people persuaded consciously, rationally, that it's something that they should do. So I'm going to take the example of social distancing in queues. So you want people to stay 2 feet, 2 meters, 6 feet, 2 meters apart. You can do so by using attitude change techniques. So rationally persuading people that this is something worth doing. For instance, the projection of virus particles are likely to be projected up to a certain distance, but will drop at some point. And so the further apart you are, the more or the less likely you are to be affected and in a way recipient of these. So you can try to use rational arguments, science-driven arguments that says that 6 feet, 2 meters apart is actually an optimal distance for you to be less likely to catch COVID-19. So anything that is kind of science-driven will be that. Now, how would you influence the behaviors? Well, let's say that as you started seeing around London outside of supermarket, you've got lines that are drawn on the floor that are 2 meters apart. This is an example of influence. People will naturally wait behind the line. I mean, that's something that we've seen way before COVID-19. If you go to the bank, you've got a privacy line. At the airport and so on, you've got a privacy line. So having physical markers, visible reminders that we need to keep our distances is a form of influence. There is nothing that uses the attitude change techniques in having those kind of marks on the ground. It really is only about, or mainly about, reminding people to change their behavior and shifting their behavior. People may or may not be aware of the science behind. They may not even think about all of this, but naturally they will fall and wait onto those lines. So that would be the example I'd give. Science-driven for a changing attitude, persuasion, and then using visual reminders of social distancing to influence and change people's behavior.
Thank you so much for that. That's very interesting. I just want to take a pause and say that we're getting an extreme amount of questions, and we only have 4 minutes pending, so I will have to be a little bit selective with some of the questions just to make sure that everybody is being heard. And my apologies for everybody if I miss anybody after this. After this session. So I just wanted to make sure that I get that out the door. A question here is, how does this pandemic affect personal insurance buying decisions? This is a very interesting question because nobody have really talked about personal insurance, but it is a problem also for people that have personal insurance through their companies, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, a straightforward answer to that, even though the reality may be slightly more nuanced, is that the pandemic is making people shift to a prevention focus. That prevention focus means that if people are able to afford insurance, they would be more likely to subscribe to insurance and buy extra insurance policies. So I wouldn't be surprised if when we're able to start traveling again, the uptake of travel insurance goes up simply because people will want to make sure that something that could happen, them having to undergo and go to hospital in a country abroad and so on, can be covered by travel insurance. So that shift from promotion to prevention is likely to make people more likely to take insurance.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. We're going to be jumping back to the idea of behaviors and how people will buy and how it would change. So one of the questions is, what changes in buying behaviors might happen? For instance, will people prefer to buy things online or stop going to cruises or hotels filled with thousands of people? Would this be an impact?
So that's a very good question, and I'm asking that question myself. I firmly believe that at the moment we're in a way victims of our selective perception bias, and we think that the way we're currently behaving is there to stick in the very long time, in the long run. But there's something that shouldn't be undermined, which is that as we go back to some sort of a normal life, we'll actually want to get away from what reminds us being in a lockdown. So I do think that people will want to go back to behaviors, will want to go back to shops, more so than people realize. There's also the dimension of solidarity, being able to show support to your local community. And last point to conclude on that, there's a fun fact that actually cruise bookings for 2021 are up compared to even pre-COVID times. So there's something that sounds that may sound very paradoxical, but the early signs are actually quite positive for cruise.
Yes, that makes complete sense. I mean, I can already see myself thinking about holiday, even though, it's a place that potentially will have a lot of people. So I guess that completely makes sense. And there's another one that is very interesting that I've asked myself as well, which is, how can we explain the rise of alcohol consumption And what implications would it have after the pandemic exhalation?
Yeah, that I have to say, it's difficult to find a kind of simple answer to that. I would take a cautious approach to answering that question, and I would say simply that alcohol is something that you can actually stockpile. So when the lockdown is about to start, people may actually go and stockpile alcohol. This mechanically leads to a rise in consumption because people have stockpiled. If you look at alcohol consumption over a longer period of time, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, a year, this will be the real key. At the moment, I would say it's too early to say that anything we've observed with the lockdown in terms of alcohol consumption can be directly attributed to the lockdown itself. It could really be stockpiling behaviors. And I don't want to get too technical, but when you're reporting sales of alcohol, you're not in people's homes seeing whether alcohol has actually been drunk. So you're just seeing the sales.
Okay, that's very interesting. And with that question, I would like to conclude the session. I would like to say thank you to all of you who have asked a question. It has been amazing and a little bit overwhelming, the amount of questions that we received. But I think some of the questions were very similar to one or the other, and I hope that we were able to get to all of those. We will have a recording of this session and we will send it to all of you after, and you will be able to also access it online. Again, thank you so much. I want to remind you that this is a webinar series from ESCP Business School. We have several more coming with also other great speakers. Ben, you have been tremendously amazing. Thank you so much again for your time. And I hope that you have enjoyed being with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much all for watching. Thank you.
Bye-bye.